Oh boy, it's Nintendo Direct. I hope they announce something like a Gen 5 remake.
Huh? Huh?
Well, while we wait for Mega Charizard Z to come out and his 3 variants, let's talk about Gen 5. Gen 5 is Pokemon Black and White and Black and White 2. Some of the games that I think are the best that came out right before the 3D era. These games were slept on release, but have become some of the most beloved Pokemon games in the entire series. They had a bunch of new features like moving sprites, Pokestar Studios, rotation battles, different stuff that just no one had ever seen before in Pokemon. But there's a subplot that I like a lot that spans over both games, sometimes linking to each other, that I really want to talk about more and explore. And that topic has to be the topic of loss. Now, loss not only meaning death, but loss is in loss of ideals, loss of character, loss of anything that a person had. So in Gen 5, I found about 4 different things that all related to the topic of loss or death that really punctuate how well written this generation was. So first we have N. N is such a well written villain and a really good definition of the term loss. To summarize N a little bit, because he is a very detailed character, basically, N is abandoned as a child. N can speak with Pokemon and eventually gets picked up by Genesis, the leader of an evil team called Team Plasma. N is raised and puppeteered to basically believe that all people are evil, and Genesis then makes him the pseudo-leader of the team. N then becomes your rival, and eventually catches the alternate legendary of whichever game you got. He beats the Pokemon League. You have to go fight him at a magic castle that just appears out of nowhere, which is really crazy for the game. You fight N for the last time. He loses, realizes that the world isn't just about truth or ideals, but a combination of both. Then, of course, Genesis comes in, tells him he's a pawn. He was useless. He hates him. You beat Genesis, and then that's the last time you deal with N for the game. In Black and White 2, he comes back later during the big fight with Kyurem. His dragon ends up being taken by Genesis, absorbed into Kyurem, and creating the opposite of Kyurem of whichever you had, so it was Kyurem Black or Kyurem White. You beat Genesis, N is like, hey, Dad, what the fuck? And Genesis is like, you're not my son, fuck you. And that puts N into a literal mental breakdown. Eventually, you meet N again when Zoroark leads you to the ruins of the castle that he had once used in the previous game. While you're in there, he basically gives you a rundown of what happened in the first game, literally him addressing that he talked to and fought the previous protagonist. Basically, the entire fight is just a rerun of what happened in the first game, even with him giving you the stone of his dragon to revive, and then you never really deal with him again in terms of story. N is the best example of loss in these games. N is manipulated and puppeted to believe that the world is evil and that Pokemon are going to be abused by humans forever. He is led to believe that the only way Pokemon can be safe is if they are separated from us entirely. And the second he meets our team of Pokemon, he learns that our Pokemon truly love us and they don't want to be separated. From there, you just see his entire morality spiral as he has to juggle the fact that maybe he's wrong, maybe everything he's known is wrong, and he can't help but try to keep battling you to prove his ideals are correct. But he loses every battle, and each time it chips away at his sanity. He slowly loses his beliefs and realizes that maybe, just maybe, Pokemon and humans can be happy together. And in the second game is truly the most lost he has ever been. He lost his home, the team that he spent years cultivating. Everything is gone, and now he has to go up against his father, who takes his legendary dragon that he befriended and fuses it to create an ultimate monstrosity of evil. And then where do you meet him again? In the castle, ruined beyond belief. The room he once held dear, now just a fragment of a happier time. He fights you one last time, he loses, and gives up his dragon, knowing full well that he has lost everything. He congratulates you, and then leaves. And then you just deal with him casually as a random battle buddy. N has lost so much simply because he was alive. He didn't even do anything wrong. He just did what he thought was right, and he still lost because at the end of the day, his ideals were never going to allow him to win. Well, after talking about such a heart-wrenching topic, let's talk about dead kids. So in Black and White 1, there's an encounter on the Marvelous Bridge where you meet a ghost girl with her Abra. She doesn't really say much to you, kind of just disappears, and then the guy behind you is like, holy shit, was that a fucking ghost? You then meet an old woman that just basically tells you, hey, this ghost comes around from time to time. After you talk to the old lady, the ghost never comes back and you never really deal with that encounter again in the first game. But in the second game, this plot is explored a little bit more when you come across a location called the Strange House. Basically, you find this house on the map and it's literally described as a house known for sad incidents that is said to keep people away. And like any fucking sane person would do, you go see it, of course. When you enter the house, it's clearly haunted. The furniture is being rearranged to try to force you into different rooms. Once you get closer to the end of the house, you find the girl you saw on the bridge, and she's crying out for her mom and her dad. Eventually, you end up in the last room, where you find a Lunar Wing, which is a piece of Cresselia, known as the Pokemon that's the opposite of Darkrai and kind of nerfs his entire ability to put you through nightmares. The little girl then appears in front of you and tells you she's been protecting it, and she wants to eventually return it to Cresselia. That's where the story kind of all pieces together. Using books and different stuff in the house, you find out it mentions stuff like Darkrai and Hypno and different stuff like that. The full rundown of the story is that a little girl was once living with her mother, her father, and her Abra. She is put to sleep by some unknown means, whether that be a Hypno, a Drowsy, or something like that, and eventually gets put under an unending nightmare by Darkrai. With no other option, her parents go and get a feather from Cresselia, known to dispel Darkrai's evil nightmares. Now, whether or not they could get it to her is very unclear, but you do find out that she does eventually die in her sleep, tormented by the nightmares of Darkrai. The parents move away because their daughter has passed, and she eventually haunts the house that is currently where we are at. The most gut-wrenching part of all is that she was haunting the Marvelous Bridge, hoping that she could meet Cresselia and give back the wing. Now, this one is like on the nose in terms of talking about loss and death. The girl passed away, unfortunately, and to be honest, with how Darkrai is mentioned in the Pokedex, that was never his intent. He never wanted to kill that girl. But the way they wrote out the story is so well done. It is truly gut-wrenching to think about that poor girl being trapped in a nightmare with her parents fiending, trying to find anything to save her, finally getting the cure, and it not working. And the best part of the ending is that you can go to the Marvelous Bridge with a Cresselia feather and summon it, and eventually leads to you being able to catch it. So in a way, it's almost a peaceful resolution to that little girl, you finally being able to give Cresselia's feather. Now, to preface this entire story, none of this is actually fully canon. You do know that the girl passes away, and you do know that it was Darkrai who did it, but you don't know much about like the whole story piecing together in the timeline. Either way, on to the third example. Now this one's more catered to the second game than really anything, because this one deals with the dragon Kyurem. Kyurem's really important in the second game because it's used to literally freeze the entire region by Genesis, the deadbeat dad from game 1. Basically, the whole story with Kyurem is that it's known as the Empty Pokemon, that description stemming from its actual body itself, as Kyurem's body is technically the original dragon that used to be a guardian protector of Unova, but was split in half because the two brothers that possessed it had the separate beliefs of truth and ideals. After its two halves became fully realized Pokemon in Reshiram and Zekrom, Kyurem was left as a zombified husk, terrifying the people it used to protect to the point where people thought of it as a monster that would come and eat them in the night. Kyurem then goes to a cave to hide and keep itself away from other people as it's losing control of its powers and slowly freezing the cave entirely. From there, it's captured by Genesis and Team Plasma so that it can be used to freeze Unova by subjecting it to painful experiments to take control of its ice powers for themselves. Then at last, it's partially reformed with whichever dragon the N captured opposite to you, whether that be it becoming Kyurem White or Kyurem Black, being used by Genesis as a weapon to defeat the trainer, and eventually being freed and captured by the trainer represents a different... Just as the story with the Ghost Girl, Kyurem itself represents loss entirely, its cold body representing the void left by the two dragons when they were separated, even its body being left malformed with its misshapen wings. Kyurem loses everything simply because of a separation of ideals. Its body is torn apart, it's feared by the people it once protected and loved, and all it can do is just simply hide away in a cave until eventually it's found, dragged out, and painfully experimented on. I like Kyurem a lot. It represents a different type of legendary design I don't think had ever been done before at the time. Whereas in like Pokemon Emerald, they made Rayquaza just to keep Groudon and Kyogre in check. But Kyurem isn't to keep anything in check. Kyurem is what's left over. He was the original legendary, and then something as simple as somebody having a different belief than the other caused the most tragic legendary to be created. The last form of loss that shows up in these games is probably one of my favorites just because it's a topic that isn't really explored too much on. In the first game, you play as Hilbert and Hilda, and you have your two rivals, Sharon and Bianca. Of course, the game plays out as previously explained in the end part, kind of giving you the whole idea of you beat gym leaders, go to the Elite Four, beat the big bad, get the legendary dragon. Basically the plot of every Pokemon game normally. But once you hit endgame, there's a piece of Unova that isn't really explored, and that's the western side of it. You can't really get to there, and you can't do anything about that other than just kind of sitting there and wondering what could be on that side. Comes the events of Black and White 2, which are 2 years after the original game end, in that previously unexplored region of the first game. You play as characters Nate and Rosa, and as you go through the game, you start dealing with smaller increments of NPCs kind of mentioning either the protagonist or hinting at them, possibly being away or just being known as like the legendary Pokemon catcher. It doesn't really come up super often up until you start fighting N again. N directly states that he remembers the protagonist and what they did for him. Heck, even in the endgame, after you've beaten Black and White 2, you meet the original protagonist's mom. When you first enter the old protagonist's home, she assumes that you are the old protagonist and speaks to you about wondering where you had been, not hearing from you, and thinking that you were still out finding a friend named N. Then, after realizing who you actually are, she explains that she knows your mom because she worked in the Poke Center when she, the original mom, was a trainer. She then has probably the most sad dialogue that I've heard in a Pokemon game, saying maybe she should go find her child, but she would feel really bad if they stopped by while she was gone, saying she wished that the two of you could meet. She also says that no news is good news, and being happy about something like that is a little bit difficult, and being a parent is super tough. Hey, post-edit, I kind of forgot to preface the original first part. In the end of Black and White, N is said to have left the country or left the region. You're told this by the detective that you meet throughout the story that I didn't really mention either because he's not prevalent to the topic. Either way, back to the last part. So after all this, everybody's talked about the champion, but you don't know where they are. It's hinted that basically the character probably went to find N, and there are a couple of theories that branch out from there, as the character never really comes back. One of the theories is just the character died, because every theory has to have death in Pokemon, and the idea that like, oh yeah, they died in another region, whatever. There's later a hint that they might be stuck in Johto, because of an old woman NPC basically saying they were trapped at a shadowy tower, and it's been hinted that that's probably the same tower where the 3 legendary dogs were formed. So both theories kind of fall into this little hearsay or just speculative, so for right now we know nothing of what happened to the main characters. At the end of the day, the topic is loss. And the loss here is that you've lost a piece of the story. A person has gone through, done everything they could, and now they are gone, presumably forever, as far as we know. And the reality is that time moves forward. Sharon becomes a gym leader, Bianca becomes a professor's helper, giving you your first starter in Black and White 2. N remembers the first protagonist fondly, and their mother misses them, but there's nothing they can do. They simply just rely on you kind of as a look into the past or a crutch to feel better. So after all these horribly sad topics and these different theories / actual canon events, what do you feel about Black and White? Do you truly feel that loss is mentioned in this game enough to where it could be seen as a subplot or even like some form of like off-branching storyline? Or is this just looking over a nostalgic game too deeply and thinking that there's something there? Either way, Black and White 2, favorite generation, extremely well written, and they need a remake because I want to play in Pokestar Studios again and fight the fucking Mecha Tyranitar because that shit was so fucking cool. Please, Nintendo, please, I am begging you. Anyway, I hope you liked the video. Stay safe, everyone.